Hello, everyone. I have the honor of introducing the speakers of the second panel, and thank you for coming back. These speakers are Peter Szendy and Shannon Mattern. I'll begin with Peter, with you. So Peter Szendy is David Hurley University Professor of Humanities and Comparative Literature at Brown University. His recent publications include Pour une écologie des images, which was published in 2021 by Minuit, with an English translation for an ecology of images that is forthcoming with Verso. Bendings, 4 variations on Henri Sala, 2019. The Supermarket of the Visible Toward a General Economy of Images, with Fordham University, 2019, of Stigmatology, Punctuation as Experience, also with Fordham University in 2018. He also curated the exhibition, The Supermarket of Images, at the Museum of the Jeux de Paume in Paris in February to June 2020. Please join me in welcoming Peter.
The title of my talk is one word, Iconoroads, which is actually a word, but maybe 2, I don't know. And not even a word. Images, we like to think, have recently become mobile, transitory, or better still, they are in transit, as we might say of travelers. It is often thought that their digitization, that is to say their translation in code, and their dissemination via social media has changed or shifted their destination from exhibition to circulation. Indeed, images today are immediately sent, posted, exchanged, shared. In other words, the routing of images is more or less simultaneous with their very coming into being. It is synchronous with their making, as evidenced by the sharing icons that appear on our screens as soon as a snapshot has been taken. As soon as an image is captured, it is addressed or addressable. It doesn't linger, not even a little, to exist or persist here before it is transported there. It is instantly prone to be sent. You actually have to be careful not to send it. Its transportability, one could say, does not occur post factum, but is part of its very texture or consistency. How, by what routes, by what detours did we get there? And how did images come to leave or go almost before they come to be or stay? But conversely, haven't images always been migratory, on the move, traveling, or transported? With these questions in mind, and they really echo the 2 beautiful talks that we've heard, and the work of Georges and the work of Jennifer, with these questions in mind, I would like to take up again and continue the analysis that I began elsewhere of what I have described as the road networks of visibility, and I look forward to Shannon's talk in this perspective. In other words, the infrastructure that makes the circulation of images possible, that supports the economy, or better maybe the iconomy, as I suggested to call it, of their exchanges. What is at stake is not only a relational approach to the image as essentially destined to and defined by exchangeability, but also a transportational concept of the image as bound to travel in order to be the very image that it is. Nadar may well have been the first to weave the lexicon of freight or cargo into the description of the making of images. In When I Was a Photographer, recalling his first attempts at aerial photography in his aerostat, he explains how, up in the air, he shot, I quote, positives on glass, which he sent directly from his basket to the headquarters by means of a very simple form of delivery, a small box which would slide down to the ground through the length of a rope, end of quote. The delivery of images, factage is the word Nadar uses in French, follows almost immediately their manufacturing. But it is in Aby Warburg's writings that we find for the first time the idea of a general circulation of images organized into a transportation network for which a whole new glossary of terms is needed. Warburg thus describes, as Georges taught us, the migration of images, Bilderwanderung, and sometimes even he maps the migratory roads, Wanderstraßen. This is a plate from the Mnemosyne Atlas. He maps the itineraries for the exchange of images. Warburg actually uses, and this interests me a lot, he uses what I would describe as iconomic terms when in his 1929 introduction to his Mnemosyne Atlas, he describes how images circulate, how they are transported. I have a quotation, it's a famous text, but it deserves to be read closely. I quote, "If the formation of style is understood as the problem of the exchange, Austausch, so this is the iconomic lexicon, the exchange of expressive values, Ausdruckswerte, then we are faced with the imperative of examining the dynamics of this process in relation to the technique of its means of transportation." And I'm slightly modifying the English translation. The German says die Technik seiner Verkehrsmittel, which is literally its means of transportation. End of quote. So the transportability of images is here clearly connected to their exchangeability according to an iconomic paradigm that pervades Warburg's text when he talks a few pages before, I quote, about the mint, Prägewerk, that coins, münzt, the expressive forms. These iconomic overtones that can be heard intermittently in Warburg's writings are amplified in his unpublished notes from 1927 titled Allgemeine Ideen, where he envisions, I quote, a savings bank for energetic expressive values, Sparbank für energetische Ausdruckswerte, and he mentions the fluctuating market value, Kurswert, of gestural expressions that have crystallized in images through time. This latent iconomic lexicon that suffuses Warburg's thinking, and it sometimes, as we just saw, surfaces explicitly, this latent iconomic lexicon leads him to offer a concept whose astonishing novelty would have to be translated in English by a portmanteau as striking as the original German word. Bilderfahrzeug, literally iconovehicles, which Warburg sometimes even characterizes as automobile. In his introduction to his Mnemosyne Atlas, he writes, I quote, again modifying a little bit the translation, due not only to its mobility, but also its technique, which fitted the multiple reproduction of its image, the Flemish tapestry is the first, albeit colossal, automobile vehicle for images, der erste noch kolossalische Typus des automobile Bilderfahrzeugs, which, freed from the wall, served as a forerunner of the printed illustrated page, in other words, the copper engraving and the woodcut, that for the first time made the exchange of expressive values, Austausch des Ausdruckswerte, between North and South into a vital part of the process of circulation that shaped the formation of European style. End of quote. So with his iconovehicular concept, if I may say so, Warburg opened up a whole new field, a field for which he imagined an unheard of lexicon with phrases that seek to capture the way images travel on their road networks. As Stefan Haug has shown by deciphering and reading closely some unpublished documents from the archive, Warburg, in the manuscript version of his 1906 article about working peasants in Burgundian tapestries, Warburg refers to tapestry as an image omnibus, Bilder omnibus, as a private omnibus for princes, Privat omnibus für Fürsten. Iconovehicles and iconobuses are specific forms of what Warburg describes in the proofs for an unpublished article from 1904 as, I quote, the global traffic Weltverkehr of images. Images didn't wait actually to be digital in order to be transported over long distances. But it is undeniable that as images begin to be encoded for sending and decoded for receiving, the duration of their journeys becomes shorter and shorter, while the image itself becomes ever more vehicular in its formats and even in its very texture. Let us consider a remarkable episode in the history of the general acceleration that affects iconotraffic and iconovehicles. On February 1st, 1907, in one of the workshops where l'Illustration was printed, it was founded in 1842, and it was a pioneer of the illustrated magazine in France. German physicist, you can see him here, Arthur Korn, gave a lecture in which he explained and demonstrated the telegraphic transmission of photographs, which aroused amazement and admiration. In an 8-page supplement, l'Illustration published the full text of Professor Korn's lecture. There was a device known as the pantélégraphe in French that foreshadowed the telephotography as developed by Arthur Korn. When I was a photographer, actually Nadar mentions it as the autographic telegraphy of Mr. Caselli, that is to say, the abbot Giovanni Caselli. In 1860, Napoleon III, after having his portrait transmitted by the machine, authorized it to be connected to the National Telegraph line, and Rossini, the composer, sent a brief handwritten score from Paris to Amiens in Normandy, a short 8-bar waltz known as Allegretto del Pantelegrafo. I hope sound works. Let's see. That's it. You will see why it's short, actually. We'll come back to the question of time. But the telephotographic process presented in one of l'Illustration's workshop later in 1907 was still a novelty, even if it was preceded by the autographic telegraphy that we've just glimpsed. As Professor Korn, as he was called in l'Illustration, explained in his lecture, which is also a performance, you will see, a photograph, in order to travel around a telegraphic circuit linking Paris to Lyon and back, a photograph had to be reduced to lines, which would themselves be reduced to segments. I quote Professor Korn's, Arthur Korn's lecture as transcribed in this issue, this supplement of l'Illustration. And I have a number of quotations from there. So it's in French, but I will translate as I quote. Let's suppose, the scientist declared to his audience, let's suppose a given photograph in Marseille divided into 100 lines, and each line into 100 elements, so the whole photograph into 10,000 little squares. The average tones of these 10,000 small elements could be telegraphed successively. On pourrait télégraphier successivement les tons moyens de ces 10 000 petits éléments. Such is the principle of any method of electric telephotography, Arthur Korn continues, but the problem, he adds, is time. I quote, supposing we only need 5 seconds for the placement of a new element, pour la disposition d'un nouvel élément, for 10,000 elements, this number is the minimum necessary for a slightly resembling portrait, it would already take 50,000 seconds, that is to say 14 hours of uninterrupted work, end of quote. So to achieve a degree of immediacy that Korn sums up in the notion of remote vision, vision à distance, and I have to recall that the term télévision had only just been coined a few years earlier. In other words, to save time, it was necessary to automate every stage of the process, the encoding of the image in order to send it, and its decoding on the receiving end, to automate this whole process by means of rotating cylinders and a selenium cell. The selenium is a chemical element which, as Korn explains, and I quote, has the curious property discovered during the construction of the first transatlantic cable, which is interesting too, the curious property of offering much less resistance to an electric current when exposed to light, so that it can automatically measure the tones of each element in a photograph, end of quote. In addition to automation, a reduction in the number of elements to be transmitted was also required. And I quote, we can send 13 by 24 centimeter photographs in 12 minutes on any well-insulated telephone line, and even in 6 minutes if the lines making up the photograph are 1 millimeter large instead of 0.5 millimeter. By the way, this whole question of lines is, really echoes what you showed us. If we define compression, as Jonathan Stern suggests, if we define compression as, I quote him, the process that renders a mode of representation adequate to its infrastructures, then we have here, with Korn's telephotographs, a compressed image, an image prepared for its transportation on a road infrastructure, a cable network that acts as what we could call, encouraged by Warburg's coinages, an Iconoroad or an opto-route. In his brief history of compression, itself compressed history, as it were, Jonathan Stern rightly notes that we don't just compress to render a mode of representation adequate to its infrastructures, as I just quoted. Indeed, conversely, we also compress to render the infrastructures adequate to representation. The infrastructures themselves are transformed. I quote Stern again, compression makes infrastructures more valuable, he writes, making them capable of carrying or holding materials they otherwise would or could not. But compressing not only adds value to existing infrastructures, for example, by enabling images to be transmitted over cables that were previously limited to telephone voices or telegraph texts. These infrastructures themselves, by being in a way compressed too, they gain access to representation. I will explain this. So, and actually, this is one of the most striking aspects of Arthur Korn's lecture in the workshops of l'illustration. As he explains, exhibiting a telephotograph of the King of England at the time, Edward VII, transmitted in 11 and a half minutes a few days earlier, on January 16, 1907, as he explains, and I quote him, experiments on the Munich-Nuremberg-Munich line, and now on the Paris-Lyon-Paris line, have shown that there is no difference if it is a real line that connects the two devices, that is to say the transmitter and the receiver, instead of artificial resistors, end of quote. And vice versa, of course, an artificial resistor, une résistance in French, inserted between transmitter and receiver can be the placeholder, the small placeholder, for thousands of kilometers of distance. It can represent them, if you wish. It can compress them for the purpose of the experiment. In other words, resistors compress the real distance between Munich and Nuremberg, or Lyon and Paris, into the reduced space of scientific experimentation. In the same way, the show or performance that Korn's lecture also aimed to be, with its staging of the telephotographic invention for the audience, brings closer what is distant. It reduces it and makes it fit within the framework of a theatrical representation. In the introductory paragraphs preceding the transcription of Korn's speech, we can read, I quote, "The experiment consisted in transmitting a portrait of Mr. President Fallières, Armand Fallières, who was the president of the French Third Republic from 1906 to 1913. So the experiment consisted in transmitting a portrait of Mr. President Fallières on the Paris-Lyon-Paris telephone circuit, a distance of 1,024 kilometers. The devices are ready. On either side of the speaker's podium are masts, you can see them on the image, are masts carrying the wires that connect the two sets to the Paris-Lyon line. The two devices, almost touching one another, are actually 1,024 kilometers apart. So this is what I call compression in the theatrical space, if you wish. Now, the lecture performance ends with a round of applause, and listeners line up to see up close the photograph of the French president after it has traveled so many kilometers, as the concluding paragraph after Korn's speech reports. I quote, "While this remarkable talk was coming to its end to great applause, the electric current had done its work. When Professor Korn's listeners, still under the spell of his precise words, began to file past the table holding his devices, they could be shown the film on which President Fallières' portrait was reproduced in print-ready negative at the end of this long journey of over 1,000 kilometers. It would have been perfect," and here I interrupt for just a second my quotation. "It would have been perfect." So what happened? I briefly interpret our reading of the final paragraph from the supplement of l'illustration in order to emphasize the importance of what is maybe even more remarkable than the invention itself, because as we will see, the euphoria that welcomes the arrival of an image transported on these early Iconoroads, the sense of success or victory, even tolerates, or it indeed feeds on, the accidents or crashes that can occasion temporary disruptions in iconotraffic. The final words with which l'illustration punctuates the event it has reported read as follow, and I continue my quotation. The portrait, would have been perfect had it not been for a slight accident in two of the stripes on the picture, which were shaky and blurred. Some kind of contact had been made on the line during transmission, producing this disturbance. This contact had lasted 12 seconds, since the effects were visible on two stripes and the cylinder takes 6 seconds to complete its rotation. But this very accident was a tangible testimony to the reality of an experiment whose success was considerable. End of quote. So as you can see, President Fallier's face has a crack. He has a scar running through it. He becomes a scar face. But this crack is immediately seen or read as the very trace of a successful delivery, or factage, as Nadar would say, as if transportation had imprinted itself on the cargo, as if the image bore the imprint of the Iconoroads it has traveled, as if the infrastructure had scarred the freight, the iconofreight that it carries. If we take this logic to its extreme, we may find that the delivery and making of the the delivery and making of the image overlap and almost coincide, as in French artist Clément Cogitor's video titled Traveling, a beautiful video from 2005. We see a truck lending its back, its tailgate, to the nighttime projection of daytime images of the road, images of the road that was traveled the day before by the same truck, so that the flickering footage of this minimal road movie without characters nor plot is transported along the highways on which it was shot. For the sake of time, I interrupted. It's a beautiful video. What happens every time the making of the image tends to merge with its delivery or transportation? What happens when they tend to be conflated as little as in President Fallier's scarred portrait, or as completely as in Clément Cogitor's road movie? In order to approach what is at stake at this crossroads between images and roads, let us turn to what Marx wrote in the remarkable pages devoted to transportation in the second volume of Capital, and I want to thank warmly Simon Horn for directing me to these passages. They will lead us straight back, or with a little detour via Walter Benjamin and Gilles Deleuze, to the photographic and filmic image. Transport, Marx argues, produces nothing that is distinct from the time it takes. Nothing that can be detached from it as a commodity that has become independent of its process of production. I quote, "People and commodities travel together with the means of transport, reisen mit dem Transportmittel, and this journeying, the spatial movement of the means of transport, is precisely the production process accomplished by the transport industry. The useful effect, Nuts effect, which is not exactly the use value, the useful effect can only be consumed during the production process. It does not exist as a thing of use, Gebrauchsding, distinct from this process, a thing which functions as an article of commerce and circulates as a commodity only after its production, end of quote. So what is proper to transport is that product and production merge and coincide perfectly, in the same way that making and delivery tend to merge and coincide in the vehicular images that I mentioned earlier. In the section dedicated to transport costs, Transportkosten, which is the third section of chapter 6, the costs of circulation, Marx goes a step further, distinguishing between circulation or exchange on the one hand and transport itself on the other. I quote, "Circulation of commodities can also take place without their physical movement, as can the transport of products without commodity circulation of commodities, even without direct exchange of products." So there is circulation without transport. For example, when I quote, "A house that is sold by A to B circulates as a commodity, but it doesn't get up and walk," end of quote. Or when, I quote again, "Movable commodity values, such as cotton or pig iron, can remain in the same warehouse while they undergo dozens of circulation processes and are bought and resold by speculators," end of quote. On the one hand. And on the other hand, for transport without circulation, so this is circulation without transport, but on the other hand, transport without circulation, well, it's very easy to imagine that any product can simply be moved without affecting its ownership. Right? To these seemingly self-evident examples that I'm tempted to say in English, go without saying, as if they had something automotive about them in the way they convey an obvious truth, I am tempted to object a little bit. Because for an immovable property, say a house, to circulate without transport, its title of ownership must undergo some sort of displacement. It must, as we say, change hands. Circulation without transport would therefore, in reality, be no more than an indirect transport. One transport, the transport of the title of ownership, for another transport, for the transport of the object. But above all, in the case of stored products, that speculation circulates without putting them into motion. Storage itself, I would argue, storage itself must be considered as a formatting or packaging equivalent to an immobile transportation, to transport in place, so to speak. The product must remain the product that it is. It must have a form of permanence through the change that affects it, because it wears out. It is more or less perishable, even if it doesn't move. Right? So that one can speculate on it as a product identical to itself. That's why storage is a sort of transportation in place. Indeed, what Marx writes about transport would apply just as much to storage. I quote him, he's talking about transport. Transport requires, but try to replace storage, transport by storage. Transport requires, for example, greater or lesser measures of precaution, hence more or less expenditure of labor and means of labor, according to the relative fragility, perishability, and explosiveness of the article. End of quote. So whether we are thinking about storage as transport in place or transport as storage on the move, what is at stake is the persistence of the commodity in being what it is. But what about images? those economic commodities that we are naturally tempted to add to Marx's list when within the transport industry he includes moving commodities and people, as well as the transmission of mere information, letters, telegrams, etc. It is worth noting in passing that, as his correspondence shows, Marx sent and received many postcards, an epistolary format that was booming in his day, and was also beginning to become an important icono-vehicle. As for the invention of the pan-telegraph, it would be actually interesting to discuss what, Georges, you so thought-provokingly analyzed in Marx's notion of images, as, in relation to his maybe unwitting use of images as, transported. As for the invention of the pan-telegraph, I was saying, the forerunner of the fax and thus of electric or electronic image transmission, it dates back to 1860, 7 years before the publication of the first volume of Capital. It was very famously by translating Marxian exchange value into an economic lexicon, as I would say, that Walter Benjamin introduced the concept of exhibition value, Ausstellungswert, whose condition of possibility seems to be the transport of images, even if his famous essay on the work of art in the age of its technological reproducibility doesn't actually say much about transportation. The new conditions of existence of the work of art, essentially visual works, despite one or two brief allusions to a choir or a symphony in the essay, these new conditions, I quote Benjamin, devalue its here and now. It's a phrase that is so famous that we can't even hear it anymore. We were talking about this with Georges the other day. They devalue its here and now by making it, I quote, transportable, transportable, and conversely, they increase its visibility. I quote, and I slightly modified the existing translation here, the possibility of exhibiting a portrait bust, the Ausstellbarkeit, the exhibitability, you can't say that in English, but literally it's what he says. The possibility of exhibiting a portrait bust that can be sent here and there, die dahin und dorthin verschickt werden kann, is greater than it is for the statue of a divinity that has a fixed place in the interior of a temple. The possibility of exhibiting, again, Ausstellbarkeit, a panel painting, Tafelbild, is greater than it is for the mosaic or fresco which preceded it. End of quote. So if we listen carefully to this text, which has, as I was saying, become almost inaudible for having been read and reread and over again, we might almost hear one of Warburg's icono-vehicles, sort of driving by. It is clear that the exhibition value of images increases in strict proportion to their deliverability. And since this increased potential for being exhibited translates into what Benjamin calls a qualitative transformation in the image's nature, we can say that, albeit indirectly, transportation is woven into its very texture, into its very mode of existence. The image becomes exhibition value as it also becomes what I would call dispatch value. It works better in French. Valeur d'exposition and valeur d'expédition. As for Gilles Deleuze, he seems to divert or reroute the Marxian concept of the general equivalent when, in the movement image, he turns the transit of images into a structural dimension of their very being. And I think there is a lot in the movement image. I will just quote a very few passages when Deleuze talks about the universe as crossed in every direction by images. There is a lot to think about also in the after echo of your talk, Jennifer. I was saying Deleuze seems to divert or reroute this Marxian concept of the general equivalent in the movement image. And that he turns the transit of images into a structural dimension of their very being. But paradoxically, and this is what I want to suggest in conclusion, Deleuze's generalization of transport as a central iconomic category, in a way the very category I'm pursuing here, it only comes at the price of its erasure, and I will try to show you that. Deleuze gives unprecedented importance to means of locomotion, that is to say, a whole series of means of transportation, airplane, car, boat, bicycle, foot, metro, these means of transportation that, I quote, the mobile camera shows or that it makes use of, thus becoming their general equivalent. So the mobile camera is the general equivalent of all these means of transportation. And the Marxian phrase is in italics in the original. From these means of transport, then, the camera, says Deleuze, extracts pure movement. What we might think of as pure dispatch value, regardless of cargo. Deleuze protests in advance against reducing this extraction to an abstraction. This is not an abstraction, he writes, for considering it as an abstraction would confirm Bergson's diagnosis that cinema is doomed to lose concrete movement. Rather than an abstraction, Deleuze sees it as an emancipation of movement, as, I quote, when the camera, he flew in before its time. So an emancipation of movement, as Deleuze says, when the camera leaves a character and even turns it back on the character, following its own movement, at the end of which it will rediscover the character. So it's sort of autonomy of the camera. But while the filmic image shows movement, while it shows how one movement is equivalent to another in the process that transforms them both into pure movement, into movement detached by extraction from the moving bodies that carry it or that are traversed by it, the filmic image itself, as imprinted on film, or as projected onto a screen, this material image in Deleuze's discourse is never conveyed. It is never transported, as if it were going nowhere and coming from nowhere. What I mean is that, in fact, there is nothing in the movement image about what we might call, with Nadar, the various ways in which the image is delivered. Its factage by balloon, or as with the Marx Brothers in the 1941 film The Big Store, by elevator. This whole ending is amazing. It's all about carrying an image and running after an image. By elevator, by roller skate, here you see the image in his mouth, or even by unicycle. Nothing in the movement image on the delivery of images, then, nor on the perpetual iconic freight that that is known as streaming, a distant heir to Arthur Korn's telephotography, with the telephone circuits replaced by internet cables or by the modulation of radio waves passing through the atmosphere. There is no mention of these various means of transportation of the cinematographic image, of its past or present-day icono-vehicles, and for a good reason. At the time the movement image was written, they hardly seemed to affect the very mode of existence of cinema, of the filmic image. Today, however, the delivery or freight of filmic images is literally interwoven with their very viewing. as on the portrait of President Fallières, it is materialized by scars and scratches, glitches, pixels that imprint on them the traces of their transit. If we don't see any iconovehicles passing by in Deleuze's writings, it is paradoxically because the image itself has become movement. It doesn't have to be transported, since it defines itself as absolute transport or transit. I quote Deleuze, "The image is movement, just as matter is light," Deleuze writes. So much so, indeed, that the hyphen linking image to movement in Deleuze's concept of movement image, image mouvement in French, is the equivalent of an equal sign. Image equals movement. Maybe it could also be read with Deleuze, but perhaps against him, very close against him, I would say, as a miniature roadmap or itinerary indicating the transportation of the image, a transport that doesn't reduce it to movement, but exposes it to movement in an essential way. For if an image is the image that it is because it comes into view. It is delivered to sight. It is transported into appearance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Our next speaker, Shannon Mattern, is the Penn Presidential Compact Professor of Media Studies and Art History at the University of Pennsylvania. From 2004 to 2022, she served in the Department of Anthropology at the School of Media Studies at the New School in New York City. Her writing and teaching focus on media architectures and infrastructure and spatial epistemologies. She has written books about libraries, maps, and urban intelligence, including A City is Not a Computer, Other Urban Intelligences, which was published in 2021 by Princeton University Press, Code and Clay, Data and Dirt, 5,000 Years of Urban Media, which was published in 2017, and Deep Mapping and Media City, 2015, both of them with University of Minnesota Press. She serves as president of the board of the Metropolitan New York Library Council, and she contributes a column about urban data and mediated spaces to Places Journal. Shannon Mattern's talk this afternoon is titled World in a Box, Cardboard Media and the Geographic Imagination. Please join me in welcoming Shannon to the event.
Okay, so I think hopefully you'll see some resonances with what some of the previous presenters have spoken about. Jennifer talking about boxes and boxes and boxes. I'm talking about literal boxes. George's discussion in the Q&A about Bernays and advertising. I'm going to talk about boxes intersecting with advertising and graphic design. And then Peter's discussion of dispatch. That's really, I'm looking at the infrastructures, material culture of dispatch. And I'm realizing I should have said a lot more about roads. That's an omission that I will have to correct in the next iteration of this. Also, speaking of transport, I have just transported myself to a new city, a new job with all new classes, all new everything. So initially, when I was invited to present here, I proposed a project I had done a while ago. It was the only thing I had that seemed relevant, and that was about listening to logistics. But then it just so happened that I had a couple spare weekends to start working on this project. So you're seeing the first draft. So I would welcome your input, but I don't know that I necessarily have a fully formed argument at the end yet, but this is a work in progress. And this is maybe a good talk to end the day with. It's a bit lighter, I suppose, than some of the others. Oh, sure, you can't hear me. Okay, is that better? All right, okay. So stacked up between the street trees along the service road behind our building on 23rd Street were thousands of cardboard boxes standing on end, from Chewy, Amazon, Blue Apron, Peloton. Before they were collapsed and deposited in the recycling center in each building's basement, those boxes brought shampoo and socks, meal kits and milk bones, stationary bikes and sourdough starter kits to the 30,000 or so humans, plus another few thousand pets living in New York's Stuyvesant Town and Peter Cooper Village in the early days of the pandemic. With the growth of e-commerce over the past 2 decades, and particularly in the past 3 years, those streets had become curbside distribution hubs where delivery truck drivers deposited mountains of cardboard boxes, which were then deconstructed by handcart-equipped laborers who shuttled goods to apartments, shops, and offices within a 2-block radius. Once wares were extracted from those boxes, the cardboard ended up back on the curb, flattened and stacked, ready for redistribution to recycling centers and eventually reincarnation as another box encasing another tchotchke. Amazon's boxes are famously adorned with a smarrow, my portmanteau for the smile arrow linking the A and the Z in the company's name, implying that they deliver with alacrity everything from A to Z. By the way, that logo was designed by a company called Turner Duckworth, which seems to me a perfect name for a branding firm. As Emily West writes in Buy Now, How Amazon Branded Convenience and Normalized Monopoly, quote, "The seeming humility of the brown cardboard box belies the scale and nature of the company's impact on retail, as well as the attention and effort that Amazon has put into its packaging, given its role as the most powerful touch point between consumer and brand," end quote. This relationship obviously isn't unique to Amazon, although the company set the stage for all those who followed in the now multi-trillion-dollar global e-commerce field. While Amazon grew from a bookseller into a global tech and logistics company, the meal kit exploded in popularity, especially among the COVID convalescent. Gathering goodies from placeless farms and kitchens, these boxes are like little pantries, providing insulation and cushioning for the fruits and eggs and chops nestled inside. Their perishable polychromatic abundance is typically reflected on the cardboard exterior, through vibrant colors and fonts capturing a range of personalities, from all caps sans serif to chunky serifs to playfully stylized scripts. Factor, a company that prioritizes clean eating and caters to the keto crowd, reflects its aesthetic character on its cardboard face. A black panel with the brand name displayed in negative, in widely kerned, or perhaps we might say, in pandemic parlance, socially distanced, Hurley sans text. That underscore after the R hints at a missing Y, suggesting that your body is an energetic machine and that factor is the fuel. It also gestures toward the blinking cursor on a command line, which frames the nutritional program as an executable script. Assembled and purchased online, meal kits are just one of myriad breeds of box whose organizational logics and aesthetics are spectacularized through unboxing videos on TikTok and Instagram. The past 2 decades have created what The Atlantic's Amanda Mull calls a packaging arms race, wherein the box is commonly designed alongside the product, and where, quote, regular people are now conversant in the language of branding, end quote, and are just as likely to brand themselves. Their own self-packaging is structured in part by the particular packages they choose to unstuff. The unboxing phenomenon has prompted some marketers, merchandisers, and designers to craft more telegenic boxes. Aurora Packaging Solutions' Chris Bradley told Packaging Drive newsletter, "I just loved the kind of trade journals I was able to encounter on these things I would never otherwise be driven to." He said, "I'm thinking about the way a YouTuber would unbox it when we're in the design process, because we want to have that big aha or wow moment." Some packaging is engineered to produce a crinkly sound, to evoke sonic memories of rustling through tissue paper or on Christmas morning, while other boxes have such a tight fit that they release a gust of air and a subtle pop when the lid slides off. Just the right amount of friction and drag cultivates anticipation, and this is an ASMR video. There's a whole genre of this. Johnny Ive, former chief design officer at Apple, told his biographer, Walter Isaacson, that he and Steve Jobs spent, quote, "a lot of time on the packaging. You can design a ritual of unpacking to make the product feel special. Packaging can be theater. It can create a story," end quote. While Apple's elegant boxes are like tiny little white cube galleries showing of objets d'art, other designs feature patterns or messages inside the box to cultivate interior ambiance and intimacy. On the internet, Mull writes, packaged products are often judged by how attractive they look in photos. Of course, merchandisers and stylists often strive to cultivate an overall retail ambiance by curating a collection of products with harmonious forms and labels. Steve Jobs reportedly demanded 50 iterations on the Macintosh box's full-color graphics, and accessory makers selected to feature their products in Apple stores are expected to work within Apple's color specs, which dictates a majority white package with an image of the product as the primary graphic, connoting a clean, almost clinical matter-of-factness. We also see the aesthetics of Instagram, flat graphics, lots of jewel hues mixed with pastels, sometimes vaguely psychedelic, materializing on the carefully curated shelves of charming provisioners, or what designer Neil Shankar has called shoppy shops. Shops that translate e-commerce into retail outlets and are very much into their shoppy with an E-ness. Think Greenpoint or Upstate. Think shopkeeper as content strategist. Some of the genre's signature brands, Fishwife tinned seafood, Diaspora brand spices, Minna tea, Graza olive oil, none of which I have tried, I will say, Magic's Brune cereal, and Banza pasta, are supplied in bottles, cans, and boxes, many of which are designed by Gander, a Brooklyn-based design studio, and made to feel small, artisanal, and, in the words of Grub Street's Emily Sundberg, local everywhere. They're not necessarily locally sourced or single origin, though. As design critic Kyle Chayka described to Sundberg, these products, quote, don't feel local to a place, but instead they feel local to the internet, end quote. But what does that mean? Even the internet is a place. It's got data centers and landing stations for its transoceanic cables, all of which shape the geographies and communities around them. Creative technologists have also found ways to cultivate localism through things like digital gardens or intimate communities within this global infrastructure. And the cardboard packages that bear graphics expressing internet retailers' purportedly local everywhere aesthetic are printed somewhere on offset presses and sourced from pines likely grown in the southeastern United States or in Brazil. Even the bigger boxes in which those packaged products are shipped from distribution centers are themselves often repurposed for local uses, in some cases providing shelter for or delivering humanitarian aid to human beings who have little time for Instagram or fancy olive oil. Cardboard boxes are often marshaled to atone for the inequities of colonialism. Consider, for instance, the boxes used to deliver manufactured goods to colonized territories and crisis zones, or to airlift babies out of Vietnam. Consider, too, the balikbayan or homecoming boxes stuffed with products from the US and sent by the Filipino diaspora back home to family members. As historian Maria Retetzi writes, quote, the cardboard box, the waste of our commercial world, is recycled in such a way as to make visible the disorder of our societies, the fault of capitalism and colonialism. Those cardboard boxes are also media. They're means of distribution, they're lithographed texts to be read, they're means of mediating buffers between outside and inside worlds. As media and design scholar Justice Nealon writes, boxes function as media of transport and information, shapers of public opinion and consumer desire, and means of targeting attention. In fact, as Walter Pepke, founder of the Container Corporation of America, about whom we'll hear a lot more later, acknowledges, quote, packages are not just commodities, they're communications, end quote. At the same time, boxes are what communications scholar John Durham Peters calls logistical media. They arrange people and property in time and space. Media scholar Ned Rossiter extends the concept, proposing that logistical media coordinate and control the movement of labor, people, and things situated along and within global supply chains. Yet the cardboard box, an arboreal apparatus, doesn't just coordinate and control. It also transforms these logistical geographies. Echoing Jennifer's work, the box is made from and remakes the landscapes across which it moves on trains and planes and trucks in accordance with the logics of containment and distribution. Researchers, artists, and consultants have paid a great deal of attention to how the metal shipping container embodies the logics of global capital. But we can make a similar argument about its humble cardboard component and predecessor. Another aside, I just wanted to shout out a friend and colleague of mine, Nader Vasogian's work on the German architect Ernst Neufert, who likewise argued that the sheet of paper and the brick, if standardized in accordance with one another, could facilitate the global circulation of information and the regulation of construction. But the cardboard box, our focus here, functions as the material embodiment of logistical logics and geographic imaginations. So first section, a media history of packaging. Before the arrival of cardboard, goods were gathered, stored, and transported in baskets, barrels, wooden boxes, and other vessels. Some of those containers made their way into merchants' shops. In The Total Package, The Secret History and Hidden Meanings of Boxes, Bottles, Cans, and Other Persuasive Containers, design writer Thomas Hine notes that before industrial production, which brought with it chain stores and national brands with their advertising campaigns, shoppers selected merchandise from open shelves, bins, and barrels, sometimes wrapped up in paper and carried it home in sacks and baskets. As another aside, I'll note that a few years ago, I wrote about this mode of display in relation to the history of the general and the hardware store because I grew up in a hardware store. Up until the mid-19th century, paper had been made primarily from rags, as well as sometimes from bark, hemp, straw, other materials. But these supplies were insufficient for mass circulation. Eventually, new wood pulp-based papermaking techniques and new industrial machines, from Foad machines to rotary cutters to lithographic presses, placed paper-based packaging at the center of shipping and retail. The burgeoning field of package engineering yielded a plethora of contraptions for containment: cans, boxes, jars, bottles, tins, tubes, and DuPont's cellophane and other polymeric films. Because, quote, paper is the easiest medium on which to print, Hine says, it provided the labels for these various vessels, which could now carry new kinds of goods like patent medicines and condensed soups that didn't readily communicate their identities because they're relatively new commodities on the market. You can really tell what they are by looking at them, so you needed a label. Brilliant Lithography, the authors of a canonical packaging textbook, which I had the pleasure of reading, was essential for selling canned food that was not visible during a purchase based on faith. The Shakers, about whom I've also written before, were among the first to use printed and pasted paper packages for their seeds, which were then displayed in a sectioned wooden box with a vibrant label. Initially, craftspeople made rigid setup, as in not collapsible boxes, things you would put a cake or a hat in, for instance, out of wood and handmade paperboard. But packaging became a mass market phenomenon, Hine says, with the paperboard folding box, which collapsed when empty and, when assembled, protected its contents from spills and destruction during transit and storage. Scottish immigrant Robert Gare had been printing paper bags and other paper goods at his factory in Brooklyn's Dumbo neighborhood when, in 1878, an operator error led to the realization that his machines, if modified, could simultaneously cut and crease paper. Gare applied for a patent and later purchased Oliver Jones' patent for corrugated paperboard, essential for the production of shipping containers. His work inspired nearly 1,000 additional patents for contraptions that fabricate and fill cardboard boxes. Cereal manufacturers, interestingly, were early advocates for the use of corrugated fiberboard for rail transport. While the railroads initially charged a premium to companies who used cardboard rather than wooden crates, over the first 2 decades of the 20th century, more and more goods rode the rails in cardboard boxes printed with new flexographic presses. As Gare wrote in the Brooklyn Eagle, and I didn't have a screenshot of that, these are standing in for a Brooklyn Eagle article, he, quote, added designs by printing, lithographing, and embossing to the exterior of the folding box, thus establishing a standard whereby the merits of the contents could be judged, end quote. Hine acknowledges that nearly instantaneous understanding of the distribution and marketing innovations this box made possible. Before industrial packaging, packages commonly displayed a product's geographic origin by featuring the company's address or mimicking the shop's sign. Later, those labels featured the factories or canneries where products were produced, often in kind of constructedly bucolic settings. Other early labels sought to convey authority by evoking heraldry. But once the product circulated separately from the producer and the shopkeeper, sophisticated and strategically designed packaging offered stockists and patrons a heuristic for evaluation. Labels on boxes and bottles signaled standardized quality and purity and predictability. They ascribed character to otherwise nondescript contents. They were a tool for simplifying and speeding decisions. They tempted and made the final sales pitch. They gave people the confidence to buy. Unita biscuits, branded by the N.W. Ayer advertising agency, distinguished themselves through their 2-layer packaging consisting of an inner seal and a vaguely Victorian purple and white cardboard box. In the company's advertisements, a little boy in a raincoat carried that box of crackers in the rain, implying that even in a downpour couldn't penetrate this double seal and compromise the product's crispness. Quaker also demonstrated the potential for packaging alchemy. Oatmeal, an uncharismatic base substance that had previously been fed primarily to horses, was now put in a small box invested with personality, outfitted with recipes that increased usefulness, and turned that to something that was desirable and profitable, end quote. Many other cereal companies deployed lithographically printed cartons to convey their healthiness and quality. Out of the piles, this is a quotation, out of the piles, confusion, and dirt of the earlier period came the cleanliness, order, precision, and efficiency of mass production goods through the employment of mass production packages of paperboard, Harry J. Bettendorf proclaimed in his 1946 book, Paperboard and Paperboard Containers. There had historically been a disconnect between the businessmen and engineers who worked on packaging and the artists and literary types who focused on advertising, but the two crafts began to converge in the early 20th century. The package itself became known as an embodied advertisement, a product ambassador, and designers drew on new psychological studies about the reception of color. Louis Cheskin's Color Research Institute tested consumers' responses to packages and advertisements. Advertising executive Ernest Elmo Calkins pushed to transform his trade from a purely verbal, not just copywriters, to a visual craft. And he launched a package design studio within his firm. This is some of his work. Quote, "Why shouldn't a vegetable can look as good as its contents?" he asked. It took a while for some companies to catch on, but many, especially supermarkets, heeded Calkins' call, and perhaps this is another way of thinking about Peter's supermarket of images. When Sainsbury's supermarkets converted to self-service in the early 1950s, the company appointed Leonard Beaumont as design consultant to create a consistent, clean, abstracted, punchy visual identity that, according to baker and food writer Ruby Tandoh, appealed to the national mood. Quote, "A feeling of British common sense, practicality, robustness, quality, and simplicity," end quote. She continues, Sainsbury's packaging in the post-war era was striking because it had to be, because the supermarket was still establishing its place in British domestic life, because self-service was new, because hygiene needed to be seen as improving. Their chain's geometric labels with their primary colors and their clear sans serif typefaces made a disconcerting experience intelligible. They also likely translated well to presentation on the new medium of television, where they'd appear in grayscale initially before color TV, while also popping in their full color glory when encountered in person on the shelf. Meanwhile, the emergence of industrial design as a field allowed the likes of Walter Dorwin Teague, Norman Bell Geddes, Henry Dreyfuss, and Raymond Loewy to transform products into their own advertisements, and enticing, like the form itself, not necessarily the box, but the object itself. An enticing form could sell itself. Many of these same designers paid particular attention to packaging. A multi-compartment aluminum tray and vividly colored box enhanced the appeal of frozen TV dinners, for instance. Hine reports that in the 1930s and 40s, the designer metamorphosed from a magician to a technician, someone who understood both the chemical reactions between shampoo and container, or between frozen peas and aluminum, and the emotional chemistry between shampoo and shampooer. Designers combined expertise in chemistry, material science, psychology, graphic design, and experimental methods, which allowed them to root their work in a purportedly objective understanding of the consumer, and to test their product's appeal. MoMA also hosted an exhibit in 1959 to, quote, appraise packages of all sorts for their design qualities, and in doing so, to re-examine and perhaps broaden our ideas of what actually does constitute a package, end quote. Which maybe raises questions from before about what is an image, similar ontological questions about what is a package. So as you can see here, they're even proposing an eggshell as a package. So while packaging was increasingly recognized as a realm of design expertise, some package designs were made to respond to other realms of design, including trends in interiors, fashion, and graphics. Here we have Isaac Mizrahi tissues. Food package labels also evolved in response to regulations that required the declaration of net weight, artificial additives, and nutritional value, yielding the nutrition facts box that now graces every box we see in the grocery store. So this is one of those boxes within boxes. Environmental concerns have also compelled the reduction of excess packaging or the rejection of plastics in favor of engineered paper packaging. As Hine writes, Contemporary packages are typically the work of designers, engineers, and one or more government agencies, including the Department of Agriculture, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Federal Trade Commission, the Department of Health and Human Services, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and the Customs Service. We can add trade organizations and advocacy groups, too. Over the past century and a half, cardboard boxes have transported the fruits of the market, displayed its excesses and embodied its lacks. They've modeled developments in paper production and brought many defunct paper mills back online to support the demands of a digital economy and all the e-commerce that comes with it. They've chronicled the evolution of workaday graphic design. Cardboard boxes have circulated the icons and lexicons of local and global brands and the standards of global distribution, addresses, weights, dates of dispatch, and so forth. And their macro-scale flows across land and sea have mapped and indexed the range and robustness of global trade. And at the intersection of these material and symbolic forms, they've emblematized logistical logics and geographic imaginaries. So while imagining the territories they'd traverse, boxes also transformed them. Robert Gare had started his operation in Tribeca in Manhattan, then moved across the East River in Dumbo for more space. In 1898, the National Biscuit Company, the makers of Unita, placed a $2 million unit order for Unita biscuits. To keep up with increased demand, Gare constructed an assemblage of buildings, including factories using then-new steel-reinforced concrete, and a network of railways and tunnels connecting the structures. And this came to be known before it was called Dumbo as Garesville. He also added a few paper mills and other building types to the menagerie too. Meanwhile, the city that enveloped Garesville became the national hub for fancy and paper box manufacturing, with several hundred businesses running huge die-cutting and creasing machines that necessitated sound structural engineering. Yet the box's role as an agent of structural transformation extended beyond the urban to the regional scale, and the same is true of other wood-based media. In their study of the Bowater Papers, a 4-issue trade publication created by the Canadian Bowater Paper Corporation in the 1950s, communication and design scholars Alexandra Kaminska and Rafiko Ruiz find that the periodical's content moved freely between lessons in forestry, manufacturing, arts and crafts, and much more, all the while marketing the company's various products. A trilogy of articles addressing the history of Newfoundland emphasized Bowater's role in shaping the province's economy in the early 20th century by setting up mills to offset the fisheries decline. Quote, "It was the coming of the pulp mills which really turned Newfoundland's forests to a profit," end quote, and thus ostensibly justified the clearing of those forests. Readers then hold the spoils of that destruction in their hands. The publication's material form, which incorporates an array of papers, inks, coatings, folds, and inserts, serves as an interactive advertisement or a demo of the company's products. It's a performative argument for paper as a versatile communications medium. We're so dazzled by the spectacle that we accept the felling of a few trees as a worthwhile price to pay. While Bowater shaped the boreal train of Newfoundland, the Tribune Company, publishers of the Chicago Tribune, harvested the raw materials for their publication in Ontario and Quebec. As historian Michael Stamm writes in Dead Tree Media, the Tribune, like all major newspapers, was both a source of public information and, equally, a mass-produced industrial good, the product of labor and natural resources. When paper was made primarily of rags, there simply wasn't enough raw material to support mass circulation. Wood pulp-based paper production made wide distribution and the mass press possible. In 1929 and 30, the Tribune ran a series of articles, and a few years later, it produced a film, kind of poorly screenshotted here, mapping the pathway from trees to tribunes. Many of the tree species prevalent in the US weren't well suited for newsprint, but spruce, plentiful in northern climates, was perfect. It was cheap, available, sturdy enough to stand up to the stresses of industrial printing, and sufficiently resistant to smudging. So the Tribune Company bought up pulp forests in Canada, built a whole bunch of company towns, and developed a vertically integrated supply chain. All the while, new paper-making processes drew on new sylvan resources. The emergence of the sulfate-based kraft process, KRAFT, drawing from the German word for power, favors long, thin, flexible fibers capable of producing paper that can carry heavy loads, withhold the stresses of shipping, and uphold its integrity when it's recycled, and kraft paper lends itself to multiple rounds of recycling, which is one of its advantages. There are plenty of disadvantages. In the 1920s, mills began producing kraft paper on a Forgener machine, which, according to the aforementioned authors of that Germinal packaging textbook, quote, ignited a paper industry expansion in the South that fiercely competed with the cylinder-made jute linerboard producers in the North. The southern U.S. offered plentiful pine. The increased circulation of boxes into different geographic terrains, particularly humid climates, necessitated the creation of yet more innovation, particularly water-resistant materials. Chicago's own specific regional affordances birthed a box company that became especially well known for its global consciousness, worldly tastes, and global extraction. The Container Corporation of America emerged when Walter Pepke inherited the Chicago Mill and Lumber Company from his father, who saw a great opportunity in the lumber industry after the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, and predicted growth in the market for wooden goods and wooden crates to ship them. William Cronin, whom some of you might know in his Nature's Metropolis, describes the decimation of the region's wooden terrains, which literally cleared the way for a new economy built on wood pulp and paper mills. So once the high-value trees were gone, you worked on the scrub trees. It's unfortunate. I would hate to be called a scrub tree. It's like categorizing as a weed, essentially. The rise of steel construction, for which Chicago was also a test bed, likewise depressed the demand for timber. So, Walter split off the company's paperboard division, merged it with the Philadelphia Paper Manufacturing Company, created mills and fabricating plants, expanded into foreign markets, and eventually became the largest maker of paperboard shipping containers in the country. At the urging of his wife, Pepke hired former advertising art director Egbert Jacobson in 1936 to direct the company's new art department, which recruited, countless prominent European and American designers. Leo Leone, Herbert Bayer, Herbert Matter, Leger, Man Ray, Henry Moore, de Kooning, Agnes Dennis, tons of others, to produce striking materials over the next few decades. A 1960 article in Print describes the Container Corporation's approach to integrated design, which they say embraces not only advertising, but also every other area in which the company meets the public and its own employees. These areas include printed forms and stationery, company identification on truck panels, interior decoration and displays, booklets and brochures, and architecture. Reading this, I realized there's so much attention paid on, for example, like Elliot Noyes at IBM and these mid-century, but this actually preceded, this kind of integrated design preceded them by about 2 decades, actually. As Jacobson explained, if you improve the appearance of stationery forms, the accounting department begins to re-examine its methods and take new pride in efficiency. The supply room clerks become discriminating critics of typography. If you paint your trucks effectively, not only does the public become familiar with your name, but your garage men become an elite among their peers. If you make a good typographic job of your annual report and illustrate it with the work of artist photographers, your stockholders show a new interest. If you engage top-notch architects to design a plant, not only do your plant managers assume new stature, but the local community is introduced to stimulating ideas in the building, which those in it had never before imagined. If you bring your offices up to date with contemporary lighting, furniture, floor coverings, and color, every secretary as well as every executive goes home with fresh ideas about interior decoration. Finally, all these activities are recognized in time by the public as the expression of the company. Not coincidentally, Pepke was also the primary patron of the new Bauhaus, launched by Laszlo Moholy-Nagy in Chicago in 1938. Jacobson started off by redesigning the company's trucks, which I guess is where I actually do kind of hint at, if not explicitly address, roads. Walter Gropius was later commissioned to design factories, and Herbert Bayer to curate exhibitions. A specialty division experimented with cardboard itself as a medium, creating cutout dolls, pop-up books, and cartons that could be repurposed as toys. Rhodes Patterson created corporate training and promotional films, a lot of which are available in the Chicago Film Archives and are really fun to watch if you'd like to do that. Albert Nair's design laboratory refined the art and science of packaging engineering. As Robin Lynch explains, The CCA's lab is oriented around a series of tests, scenarios, and technologies which attempt to grasp the total range of processes and senses associated with packaging. They actually drew a lot of inspiration from Moholy-Nagy and the New Bauhaus and try to turn that into a methodology, within the lab. The basis for the visual appeal of the package is graphic design, declares the narrator in Patterson's film, 1963 film, The Packaging System. This component of the packaging system is itself a total of several elements: color, typography, illustration, design form, texture, and trademark. The unique array of the design laboratory instruments helps make objective evaluation of designs and design elements, end quote. Jacobson produced a color harmony manual, which you can see on there on the far right, which circulated globally among artists, designers, and craftspeople and established cross-disciplinary standards among kind of color use in various trades and fields. Pepke recognized that all of these elements add up to a means of free advertising for their customers. Wherever the boxes are seen, they have the potential to imprint a vibrant brand identity. Early advertisements designed by the likes of A.M. Cassandre and Tony Zepf focused on the mechanics and aesthetics of integrated packaged production. As Pepke described the company to the Society of Security Analysts in 1945, the Container Corporation is the most integrated unit in history. It sells containers, manufactures paper and straw board, produces its own sulfate pulp, collects waste paper, and delivers its finished containers with 300 units of its own trucks, tractors, and trailers. Sounds a lot like Amazon. As we can see in the final advertisement on the right here, which is called One, the tree has to denude itself in order to take part in this symbiotic relationship. Note, too, the mix of visual styles, including the abstract, almost axonometric representation of the box in the upper right. Many of the advertisements employ isotype-style graphics, which are meant to circulate and communicate globally. The container, in particular, appears as a frictionless mobile medium affording smooth circulation. Design historian Robert Gordon Fogelson proposes that managing a corporation of CCA's size was also a fundamentally visual problem, a matter of conveying to customers, employees, and stakeholders or stockholders the unity and stability of the integrated organization. This same visual language reappears in Bayer's World Geographic Atlas, produced in an edition of 30,000 and distributed to the company's customers, colleagues, and various dignitaries. This is the part of the project I haven't gotten to yet, so I don't have a whole lot to add. I'm sure there's going to be a lot here. Also, I'll note that there's Benjamin Bennis just published a really beautiful book this year that's all about the Atlas that you're welcome to look at afterwards if you like. But I will say that Bayer presciently addressed the warming of the climate in this atlas and intended for it to reveal the limited availability of land, the abuse of forests, the restricted reserve of minerals, the problems of soil erosion, and the vast abuse of energy. And this is in the mid-50s. In the hope that this knowledge would compel the atlas's powerful readers, remember it was not mass distributed, it was sent out to chosen people, stakeholders, customers, to take action on the climate. Of course, the CCA itself and the vast infrastructural networks that its boxes package together contribute to these very lamentable phenomena. Some of the company's early ads also evoked the company's commitment to recycling. Environmental historian Peter Anker reports that Pepke underinvested in timberlands to supply his mills, so he sought to recycle waste paper into cardboard. And that ended up being a highly successful program. By 1940, the CCA, reportedly at least, produced 90 to 95% of its cardboard from waste paper. The next advertising campaign focused on wartime applications of cardboard boxes, like delivering munitions and supplies, for instance. And after that, the CCA launched a sequence of campaigns that, rather than explicitly referencing the company or its products, instead featured various states and territories. The United Nations was the name of one of them, and then various ideas, various great ideas inspired by the Great Books series, of which Pepke, again, was a strong proponent. It's the whole University of Chicago Great School. He was friends with a lot of the folks at the University of Chicago. These ads commonly circulated in magazines like Fortune, itself a force of mid-century graphic design, Business Week, and even Time, where they'd reach a general readership. Bayer later gathered them together into a traveling exhibit, Modern Art and Advertising. These geographically and philosophically themed campaigns exemplify Pepke's internationalist ambitions, both as a businessman and as a public intellectual, or a self-fashioned or imagined public intellectual and cultural force. Is that rain? Yeah, wow, that's okay. Pepke declared that once the company had completed its wartime mission to deliver supplies, it would take on a new challenge. It would address many extremely important unsolved problems in the field of education, health and welfare, government, philosophy, foreign and international policy. This is a paper box company wanting to take on all this stuff, which is kind of hubristic. They wanted their advertisements to serve a dual purpose as a public education campaign. And they also, some of you might know, Pepke was behind the establishment of Aspen, Colorado, as a hub for conferences and festivals to educate the social and financial elite. He commissioned Herbert Bayer, again, to design and promote the town, and he worked with Jacobson to launch what's now known as the International Design Conference. So the Aspen Institute came out of paper boxes again. All this ostensibly benevolent global outreach and worldly sensibility parallels the Container Corporation's reach into international markets, its acquisition of foreign companies, and its extraction of natural resources. Even Aspen, itself a former mining town subjected to an earlier era of extraction, would now be mined for its natural beauty and intellectual inspiration. It was supposed to kind of prime people to have really great ideas, to solve the world and make money at the same time. Yet John Massey, the company's third design director, explained that when strategically siting new mills, plants, and offices, rather than expanding into developed regions, the company sought to bring CCA's management abilities, outstanding packaging technology, and marketing know-how to developing countries where the company could provide assets not available locally. So that's their justification for colonialism. Justice Neeland, the media scholar we met earlier, notes that the visual idiom appearing across the company's ads, atlases, annual reports, and films, and trucks, and everything else, is commonly free of topographic detail, and that abstraction serves to conceal the violence of colonial extraction and unseen development, or uneven development. One of few nods to localism are the company's occasional depictions of slash pines grown in the southern United States, a species favored by the craft pulp process, which uses tremendous amounts of water and releases tremendous amounts of toxins. Even the CCA's United Nations advertisement series, Robin Lynch proposes, depicts many landscapes that are kind of, the hint is that they're ripe for extraction, lands that were in fact subjected to deforestation at the hands and saw blades of the CCA at some point in time. Starting in 1953, the company started clear-cutting tropical rainforest along the lower Colima and the Andean forest to make way for pine and eucalyptus for paperboard. As the Times' Matthew Shear notes, the ever-expanding need for cardboard is still cultivating monocultures, especially with the rise of e-commerce, or the increasing flourishing of e-commerce, particularly in Brazil and in the southeastern United States. He writes, in Georgia and Alabama, family operations have given way to small empires of tree plantations, built largely on private land, and largely by planting pines in a region where other types of trees or other types of crops like cotton once grew. It's just pines, pines, pines as far as the eye can see. Again, we see these substrates and the images they carry being constituted by the terrains they traverse. Getting near the end here. So perhaps there's some cosmic logic or humor in tracing the Consumer Corporation's ultimate fate. In 1968, it merged with Montgomery Ward, the trailblazing mail-order business turned department store, forming a new company called Marcor. I want to find out what that portmanteau is all about, which later became a subsidiary of Mobil Oil, a fellow extractivist. Mobil then sold Marcor to Jefferson Smurfit, a Scottish box maker, which is still making packages as Smurfit Kappa Group. The box thus returns to Scotland, home of Robert Gare, who, through error, learned that it's possible to simultaneously cut and crease. Because this is a brand new project that I'm sharing with you that I rushed to pull together for this event, I still need to develop the conclusion to figure out how to box it all up. But I know I want to close with the work of a few artists who use post-consumer materials, who reclaim the disposable, who transform the ground of the cardboard substrate into figure. In addition to Dada and Fluxus and the other usual suspects, I'd likely draw on the work of Ruth Hardiger, who casts concrete in cardboard models that are made to not be able to bear the contents weight. She calls them conundrums. So these conundrums are clearly a concrete critique of an unsustainable system. I'll likely also integrate tapies, collages and assemblages that integrate torn, folded, weathered materials, including paper and cardboard, which are meant to evoke degradation, fragility, and humility. I'd also pack in Georgia Dickies, which you can see on the right here, sculptures, which graft wrapping paper, magazine ads, shopping bags, clippings, and cardboard boxes that, in a fashion that evokes both disposal and conservation, care and disregard. What do these engagements with the already spent box tell us about the limits of containment and the infrastructures on which they depend? How does the deconstructed medium embody messages or constitute material images that contradict those designed meticulously into its pristine form? What geographic imaginaries, what systems of value are necessarily broken, is a necessarily broken box, uniquely well-equipped to contain and transport? And that's where I'll stop. Thank you.
So, Peter and Shannon, thank you very much for those both provoking, thought-provoking, and wonderful talks. We have a few minutes, hopefully until after the rain, because it looks like the rain will stop in like 15, 20 minutes. And I just want to also remind everyone that there will be a reception downstairs on the second floor right after this. There are 2 mics on the both ends, please. Yes, and then.
So Deleuze talks about the movement of the film through the projector. He talks about the movement of the film onto the screen, and then the movement of the plot of a film, and the kind of movement of the film through your mind as you watch it. So I think I almost think it's an addition to think of the movement that you're talking about of the streaming, and it's interesting. I think it's a Deleuzian sense, but I guess I just have a simple but difficult question, which is, for Benjamin, the movement of images, as you said, you quoted him, right? It's a qualitative change. It changes the way we understand the image. And so I'm wondering, in what you said was the immediate communicability, shareability of the image. I mean, so it's a simple but impossible question. So how does that change the way we look at the image, given that notion? How do you read that new, that kind of revolution that you trace so beautifully in a kind of Benjaminian mode, how we understand images anew? So, thanks.
Thank you. I will try to answer simply and quickly. In a way, I've always thought that the Benjaminian translation of the 2 Marxian concepts that go together as opposites, use value and exchange value, which he translates into cult value and exhibition value in visual terms. I've always thought about them as 2 extremes on a spectrum. So there is pure use value, but basically pure cult value. Which basically you never find, but it's sort of extreme towards which images can tend. And pure exhibition value, which would also be sort of extreme if you imagine, if you imagine images that don't even stay in view, but pure circulation. It would be like the speeding up of exhibition value up to its extreme. But then, as soon as you say that, these extremes, they start to sort of cross or enter into a chiasmatic relation, because pure exhibition value, that, meaning that images that you don't even see, sort of travel out of sight. They travel so much that you don't see them anymore, so they travel out of sight. Not unlike maybe images that travel so quickly and so far that you lose sight of them. And they share the kind of pure cult value that Benjamin describes, for example, when he thinks about statues of the Virgin that are so high up in a church that you don't even see them. So it's a complicated. It's like a spectrum, but at the same time, it ends this sort of yes, cross. Or now, your question. I mean, this is a hypothesis. It's a working hypothesis. I try to think with an additional notion that is somehow present in Marx, but virtually, so to speak, which would be the notion of I mean, what is transportation adding to this binary picture of use value, exchange value, and conversely, what does transportation add to cult value and exhibition value, dispatch value, if we want to find a name. It's not easy. I don't know. I still have to work it out. That's the sort of conceptual geography that I want to think about. I don't have a fully worked out answer. But it's definitely something that we have to think about, since images today, I mean, it's not enough to say that they famously lose their cult value. It's not enough to say that they tend to have only exhibition value. They maybe don't even have, or many images, they don't even have an exhibition value. They have a pure dispatch value. When you take a picture, no one sees it, it's already gone, And this is somehow where it draws its value from. So I think this spectrum, which is already very complicated and chiasmatic, should be, I don't know, sort of suffused with this additional notion that maybe can help or not help, but complicate things further, which is dispatch value. Yeah.
This is for Shannon. Thanks so much for your paper, and it's a really exciting project. And I just wanted to, it's more of a comment than a question, I think. You, in the context of the Container Corporation of America, you were speaking so much about Gropius, about Herbert Bayer, about the new Bauhaus in Chicago. And you showed, I'm not sure if you showed the same Santy-Shavinsky image twice, or if it was two different images by Santy-Shavinsky, because it went by much too quickly for me. But all of this is, made me think about, these are all émigrés fleeing the Nazis. And that's another form of migration that's going on behind the scenes, or maybe extraction. And I thought a lot more, I would love to hear a lot more. I don't know if you know Shavinsky and his background, but he was a student at the Bauhaus, and then he was a master at the Bauhaus. And then in 1933, he was, he left for Italy, for Milan, and he learned more design work there. He was a theater person, and he was at the Black Mountain College teaching there. Never made it to the new Bauhaus in Chicago, although he'd been invited. And then he was an artist, but he was supporting himself with work for the Container Corporation and also the various really bizarre dental informational groups in New York, making extraordinary Bauhaus-inflected, surrealist-inflected, truly bizarre and extraordinary things. But I think there's such a story behind your story about the people who are circulating, artists who are turning to design of packaging in order to support themselves, having been booted out of their own land. So I would love to see you do more in that direction.
That's great. That's a great recommendation. And also it was interesting to find that a lot of these folks, it's also interesting to find that a lot of these folks worked for the various armed forces during the war, producing kind of informational or manuals, repair guides, things of that sort, both the American and the immigrant designers. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, please. I think for the recording purposes.
A question for you, Peter, and it's sort of piggybacking on Stuart's question. So I presume you would allow that the transport of the image begins in the imagination. right? That there's always already transporting of the image in the imaginary production of the image, right? I presume you won't allow that. If you do, then I'll ask my question. If you don't, we have a problem.
I'm in front of a double bind, but I definitely do. Yes, yes.
So I wonder if that changes, though, the possibility of talking about what you represented as transporting or freighting of the image, what it does to time and space, which seem to be necessary for that sort of, if we call it a metaphorical sense of how the image travels, right? You know, if Deleuze's movement image reaches its limit point, right, where it becomes a time image. Bergson has memory interfere with time. You know, Deleuze again will move from the idea of espace quelconque, I don't know how that's translated, but any space whatsoever, and then to the crystal image and so on and so forth. It seems to me in all these cases that time and space is being reconceived. So, I mean, would you agree with that? Would you say something about that? And what you were saying at the end, but also slightly perhaps against or against the grain of Deleuze, were you somehow trying to deal with that question, or did I misinterpret that?
Thank you. So this calls indeed for clarification, but I will try to keep it short. In a way, what interests me in images that are actually transported is quite stupid and stubborn. It's the materiality of the image that is carried, right? So, of course, I have nothing against the idea that imagination already involves transportation, and we could go a long way with this thought. It's a question of strategic context and what we want to do. I'm ready to go a long way along this path. If we begin to think about, I don't know, the trajectory of the Freudian representation, clearing a path, or the whole lexicon and imaginary of paths and ways and etc. We can do a lot. But what I was really trying to work with is much more stupid or literal. I mean, stupidity and literality are maybe sort of accomplices. It's really very literal. It's taking an image and carrying it somewhere, you know. And I was just struck by the fact that the lexicon, the conceptual system, the whole philosophical construction that Deleuze produces, which is brilliant, and I work with this all the time in the movement image and the time image, it somehow never comes to the actual transportation of an image. It's striking. I confess that I don't know what to do with it. I'm not saying that, oh, okay, let's use this against Deleuze. No. I mean, it's a beautiful reading of Bergson. It's a beautiful philosophical system. I just don't know what to do with it. So it was a kind of open-ended, unconclusive remark on my end. That's honestly, really honestly, that's all I can say for the moment. I just wonder, how is that possible? Oh,
then we're going to go to two questions.
No, let's go to other questions. Then
Yes.
Thank you both so much. Peter, I wanted to ask what I hope is a question. I was really taken with what I took you to be laying out, that this kind of transportation of images that may take the form either of compression, maybe that's too much, compression or decomposition, which may turn out to be the same thing as an image is compressed by decomposing it into a kind of writing or code. But and the suggestion that this happens not only when an image is sent, but in front of you, whenever any image is in storage or stationary before you. And these sort of threads, if you will, and on top of that, the freedom that you suggested through Deleuze of that this is not an abstraction of the image, but was it liberation or emancipation of the image? And I wonder, I apologize for going beyond the realm of your talk a little, but I can't not think of two regions that I would love to hear you comment about, or two texts. One of them is Freud's Traumdeutung, in that there also the terms are, if you will, compression and transport, and Verdichtung and Verschiebung. And I wonder if we're asking, as I take some of the questions to have been asking, what is the stationary transport that it happens in front of us that gives an image its freedom? Could it be a form of dream happening in the image or in the spectator? The second text, and I don't know really what to do with this, but given the many hints about weaving in your talk, is Book 2 of the Odyssey, in which Penelope is unraveling her tapestry so that she can weave it again and again and again, in order to never commit both to a final version of the tapestry and to a marriage. And I wonder if there's something there again in the stationary texture or reduction again and again to the thread as the kind of, which is itself woven as the resting place of this kind of stationary and yet infinitely reweavable freedom. So I don't know how to make that fully question mark.
Here, this.
Okay, thank you. Does it work? Yes, okay. Thank you for this wonderful question, which actually brings us back to David's question also, I think. And now I'm trying, maybe I'm still processing David's provocative question, and through the one you asked, I'm starting to think, what about transportation, containers, packaging as possible categories to think about what happens inside one's imagination? I mean, could these categories be sort of blown up to the dimension of the cosmos? That's the question you were asking. Or could they sort of be imported and in order to work with them in this kind of microcosm, inner microcosm? I mean, is there something like a container when we think about the trajectories of images in the unconscious, et cetera, et cetera? And actually, I'm also thinking that I'm sure that advertisement and packaging industry has worked a lot with psychoanalysis in terms of, yes, yeah. Exactly what Georges was alluding to in terms of propaganda. So these are scattered thoughts. I just wanted to add one, and I take this opportunity to do so, about, it was a thought that really came to me listening to your talks. When I thought about this title, transporting images, I didn't think about the fact that it can be read really in two ways. And I mean, what you said about containers really made me think. Transporting images can be, you can say it about images that are do the transportation, images as the subjects or agents of transportation, but also images as the object of transportation, as the things that are being transported. And transporting images sort of conflate the two, what in philosophy or whatever could be called objective and subjective genitive. I was just thinking, containers are both, you would say?
Yeah, I would say so, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I tried to show that they're kind of media on multiple technical levels, multiple ontological levels. They carry graphics on their surfaces. They, I had a whole paragraph in there where I tried to kind of itemize the various ways they form as media, but I believe they do transportation in multiple senses of the term also. So, yeah.
Yeah. And just I didn't answer about weaving, then I think we'll have to stop. I'm afraid that the wine from the reception will go away in packages. But weaving, yes, I think we have had many visions of weaving. In a way, the images that you've shown, these images that are full of threads, right? But also paper. It's not exactly woven, but it's full of threads. Well, the history of art is full of threads also, be they material or symbolic, the motif of the thread, and the veils. And so I think that weaving is definitely, yes, a good thread to follow.
Thank you for both papers. I have a brief question to Peter. As I understand, Peter, your whole project is about the circulation and movement of images once they are finished, finished entities, right? Okay, so I was thinking, what if one were to expand the projects and take into account the movement that embedded within the production and the making of images? While you were talking, I was thinking of two instances. One would, you could think of the kinesthetic properties that go into making a painting or a photograph. But also I'm thinking in terms of the history of photography since you mentioned Adar, taking, from the 1839 when Arago tried to sell the daguerreotype to the French Chamber of Deputies. He said that with this invention, we can bring immediately hieroglyphics from Egypt back to France. So the traveling, migration, circulation was there from the very beginning, before even the production of photographic images. So what if that your project, your iconomy project includes that moment of conception and production of the image before it even becomes a finished entity for circulation?
Yes, thank you. So I know this sounds contradictory, what I'm about to say. In a way, I'm interested in transportation of images, as I guess we all are here. And in order to think about transportation, you have to think about a product that is being transported. I mean, there's a sort of minimal semantic consensus, right? Otherwise, you're not talking about transportation anymore, but production. On the other hand, precisely what is interesting is how transportation is woven into the very fabric, right? And this is what we are talking about here. So I wouldn't say that what interests me is the post-factum delivery of ready-made pictorial products, right? What I find interesting is the increasingly the way transportation increasingly suffuses or is woven into the very fabric or texture of images. This is why I'm interested in glitches, pixelization, how do you say,
Pixelization?
pixelization, etc., etc.
Okay, I'm going to give the last closing remarks to you.
Two.
To you.
Oh,
so
to
that
me.
we can finish.
Thank you.
Go for the-
Well, they will. They
so that
will
we can
be.
go for the reception.
Absolutely. They will be very brief. I just want to thank you all really warmly for coming, and to thank our speakers who really gave beautiful talks, very thoughtful talks, and they were interwoven. That's the last time I will use this metaphor, in all kinds of ways, and echoed one another in many ways. I definitely hope that this starting conversation can continue with these wonderful different perspectives, and maybe take the form of some publication. They will be available in video at some point. I think everyone agreed to be filmed, and that's it. We have a reception waiting for us, and we could continue more informally. And I also want to say that on Monday, for those of you who understand French, you are invited to Georges de Duberman's last seminar session. He is here in the French and Francophone Studies Department for a 10 days residency organized by Laura Odello. And you should come. It's been a great seminar. So if you're around and if French is not an obstacle, please come.